Vicious bikers harass a quiet woman. Her shocking move leaves them speechless. The sound of engines roaring echoed through the quiet park as a group of bikers pulled up on their loud motorcycles, each of them exuding an air of arrogance. They were known in the area for causing trouble, their intimidating presence enough to make anyone hesitate before crossing their path. The woman, seated alone on a bench, was no stranger to discomfort. She had always been quiet, her preference being to remain unseen and unheard. But today, that quiet solitude would be shattered. As the bikers circled the bench, they exchanged glances, their eyes narrowing at the young woman who sat in the center of their ring. She looked up briefly, but her gaze fell back to the ground, unwilling to meet the eyes of those who were clearly enjoying the power they held over her. One of the bikers, a particularly tall man with a dark beard and a leather jacket that looked as if it had been through too many fights, was the first to speak. His voice was laced with mockery, a cruel undertone hiding beneath his words. "Hey there, sweetheart. You lost?" he asked, the smirk on his face growing wider as he looked down at her. The woman didn't respond, her hands clutching the edge of the bench, her body stiff as she fought the urge to shrink away. She had learned long ago that it was better to remain silent than to provoke trouble. But the bikers weren't finished. One by one, they approached, their laughter echoing around her like a haunting soundtrack. They leaned closer, blocking her view of the park. Another biker, with a cigarette dangling from his lips, casually ran a hand over the top of her head, pushing her hair back roughly as he spoke in a slow, mocking tone. "You don't belong here, do you? You don't even look like you could handle a real challenge." The woman felt the pressure building, the heat rising in her chest as the words and gestures pushed her to the brink. She knew that if she didn't act soon, this would continue. She knew that appeasing them wouldn't work, it would only encourage more taunting. She had to do something unexpected. With one swift motion, the woman stood up, her back straight as she looked each of them in the eye. The bikers paused, momentarily thrown off by the sudden shift in her posture. This was not the quiet, submissive woman they had assumed they could dominate. Her eyes, once avoiding theirs, now locked with the leader's. There was no fear in her expression, only something far more unsettling. A calm that felt like an undercurrent, a storm waiting to break. "You think you can control people by intimidation," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But you don't know me. And you don't know what I'm capable of." A ripple of confusion passed through the group. They had expected her to break down, to cower, to beg for mercy. But the woman wasn't afraid. Her eyes remained steady, her breathing calm as she held their gaze. The air around her seemed to shift. Without warning, she turned and made her way toward her backpack, which was lying by the bench. She pulled something from it, something unexpected. The biker's eyes followed her every movement. What could a quiet woman like her possibly have that would change the situation? She pulled out a sleek, black device and pressed a button. Immediately, a loud sound rang out, a horn, followed by the blaring noise of a high-tech alarm system. The sudden, deafening sound sent a shockwave through the group, their faces contorting in confusion and shock. But it didn't stop there. The woman calmly pulled out a second device. She pressed another button, and to their shock, the nearby park lights flickered on and off in a fast-paced strobe pattern, disorienting the bikers further. In an instant, they realized what was happening. She had triggered a security system. "Wait, what is this?" one of the bikers sputtered, taking a step back. "Is she calling the cops?" The woman didn't respond. She simply smiled, a hint of triumph in her expression. She knew it was too late. By now, the police had been alerted, and the local security cameras were now activated, recording everything. As the bikers stood frozen, unsure of how to react, the woman turned and began to walk away, leaving them standing in stunned silence. The scene she had created had shattered their sense of power. They had expected her to be weak, to be vulnerable, but instead, she had taken control. She had turned the tables, not with force, but with intelligence, and with a plan they couldn't have anticipated. The sound of sirens soon echoed through the park, signaling the arrival of law enforcement. The bikers, who had once surrounded the woman like predators, now found themselves on the defensive. They quickly mounted their motorcycles, trying to escape before the authorities arrived. But the woman didn't look back. She had already won. In the distance, a police officer approached the woman, who was now standing confidently near the park's entrance. She gave him a brief nod, indicating that everything was under control. "You did the right thing," the officer said, his voice low but respectful. "Those bikers have been causing trouble in the area for a while. I'll make sure they don't bother you again." The woman gave a small smile. "I didn't need you to save me," she said, her voice calm. "I just needed to make sure they knew they couldn't control me." The next day, the story spread across the city. People couldn't stop talking about the quiet woman who had taken on a group of intimidating bikers and come out victorious. Her story was shared across social media, with countless people praising her bravery, her quick thinking, and her refusal to let fear dictate her actions. The bikers, who had thought they could harass anyone they pleased, now found themselves facing public shame. Their reputation was shattered, their confidence broken, and their attempts to intimidate the woman had turned against them. And as for the woman, she didn't seek fame or recognition. She was simply someone who had taken a stand when it mattered most. Her actions had proven that sometimes the best way to defeat fear and intimidation is not with force, but with intelligence, courage, and a little bit of planning. The city now had a new hero, not one who fought with violence, but one who fought with strength of character. As the days passed, the story of the woman who had outwitted the bikers continued to spread throughout the city. News outlets picked up the story, and it quickly gained traction on social media. The quiet woman, once an unnoticed figure in the crowd, had become a symbol of empowerment. Her brave and intelligent move had left a lasting impact on the city, and people couldn't stop talking about it. Some viewed her as a heroine, others, a pioneer of courage who had shown the world that it wasn't just physical strength that mattered, but the power of mind over matter. She had fought back against intimidation with grace and intelligence, and in doing so, she had proven that anyone, no matter how quiet or unassuming they might seem, could rise above their circumstances and take control of their situation. The woman, who now preferred to remain anonymous, was contacted by several news outlets, but she chose to decline their interviews. She didn't want the spotlight, she didn't need the fame. Her actions, after all, weren't motivated by the desire for recognition or praise. She simply did what needed to be done to protect herself. But that didn't stop the city from applauding her. People who had seen her pass by in the park before now recognized her, offering nods of appreciation or words of admiration. There was a quiet sense of respect that had grown in the streets, as if everyone had witnessed something truly powerful, something that made them think differently about themselves and their ability to stand up to adversity. One afternoon, while she was sitting at a small cafe in the park, the woman was approached by a young man. He looked to be in his mid-20s, wearing a backpack and holding a notebook in his hands. He hesitated for a moment before walking up to her table. "Excuse me," he began, his voice nervous but sincere. "I don't mean to intrude, but I saw you in the news. What you did, it was amazing. I'm not sure if you know this, but you've inspired a lot of people, myself included." The woman looked up, raising an eyebrow in curiosity. "Inspired," she repeated, her voice soft but interested. The young man nodded. "Yes. I've been dealing with some stuff, you know? Life's been tough and I've been feeling kind of powerless. But when I saw how you handled the situation with those bikers, it was like a light bulb went off. You showed that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm and take control." The woman smiled faintly, touched by his words. She wasn't used to being acknowledged in this way, and it felt strange but also empowering. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she replied modestly. "I just did what I had to do." The young man sat down at the table without being asked, pulling out his notebook. "But that's just it. You didn't have to fight back physically. You used your mind, and that's what people are missing. You made a choice, and that choice changed everything. I've been thinking about it ever since." The woman leaned back in her chair, intrigued. "And what have you decided?" The young man paused, considering her question. "I've decided to stop letting other people intimidate me. To stop being afraid. I'm going to start taking control of my life, one step at a time." The woman nodded thoughtfully, feeling a sense of pride swell in her chest. She wasn't a hero. She was just a person who had made a choice when faced with adversity. But hearing someone else recognize the importance of that choice reminded her that she wasn't alone. Her actions had sparked something in others, and in that moment, she realized how much power she truly had, not just for herself, but for others as well. In the weeks that followed, the young man, whose name was Alex, kept in touch with the woman. He started a small blog where he wrote about personal empowerment, self-improvement, and how ordinary people could rise above their fears and challenges. He often cited the woman's story as the catalyst for his own transformation, and his blog quickly gained a following. He was no longer the quiet, intimidated person he had once been. Alex took on new challenges at work, spoke up more in his personal life, and began to take his dreams more seriously. It was clear to everyone around him that something had changed. Meanwhile, the bikers who had harassed the woman that day had faced the consequences of their actions. The security cameras had captured their every move, and the footage had been handed over to the authorities. Though the bikers managed to evade arrest for a short time, it wasn't long before they were caught. They were fined for their behavior, and some were even banned from certain public spaces in the city for a period of time. It wasn't just about the legal consequences, it was about the public backlash they faced. What had started as a harmless prank had turned into a lesson for them as well. The image of the quiet woman standing her ground, unfazed by their intimidation, had stuck with them. They had underestimated her, assuming that they could push her around without consequence. Instead, they had become the ones who were humiliated, their reputations tarnished by their own actions. A month later, the woman returned to the park, sitting once again on the same bench where it had all started. It was a quiet afternoon, and the sounds of nature filled the air. The city felt calmer now, almost as if the events of that day had changed something within the people who lived there. As she sat there, her mind wandered back to the bikers, to the young man named Alex, and to the countless others who had come to her with words of gratitude. She had never expected this kind of attention, but she was glad to see the ripple effect her actions had caused. She had inspired people to stand up for themselves, to take control of their lives, and to realize that strength didn't always have to come in the form of physical might. For the first time in a long while, the woman felt at peace with herself. She had proven something not just to the bikers, but to the world, and to herself. She didn't need to be loud, aggressive, or confrontational to make a difference. Sometimes, the greatest power came from the quiet moments, the ones where you stood firm and refused to back down. As she sat there, taking in the peaceful surroundings, a sense of contentment washed over her. She knew that her journey was far from over, but she had taken a step towards something much bigger than herself. She had taken control of her own narrative, and that was the most powerful thing of all. The woman's actions had set off a chain reaction in the community, and it didn't stop with Alex. As more people heard about the bikers' failed attempt to intimidate the woman and the subsequent consequences they faced, many began to rethink how they responded to similar situations. The city, which had once seemed indifferent to the suffering of individuals, now buzzed with the potential for change. It wasn't about heroism or extraordinary feats. It was about the everyday decisions that empowered people to stand up for themselves and others. For the woman, whose name was still a mystery to most, the shift was both empowering and humbling. She had never considered herself a leader or a symbol of change. Yet, the more she heard from those around her, the more she realized how much influence her quiet act of resistance had on the world. Her own sense of self-worth had grown, but she knew it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about knowing that she had made a difference. The media, once quick to dismiss her as another victim, began to pick up on the message her story carried. The story of the woman who stood up to the bikers was now more than just a viral headline. It was part of a larger cultural shift. Social justice organizations reached out to her, asking if she would speak about her experience at community events. And though she had no intention of becoming a public figure, she couldn't help but be moved by the request. She agreed to speak at one such event, held at a community center not far from the park where the confrontation had happened. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, some from the neighborhood, others from outside, all eager to hear her story. As she stood at the front of the room, she was surprised by how nervous she felt. The woman who had once remained silent in the face of fear, who had kept to herself, was now speaking to a room full of strangers who were eager to hear what she had to say. She took a deep breath and began. "I'm not here to tell you that I did something extraordinary," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I'm here to tell you that in every moment, we have a choice. We can choose to let others control us, to cower in fear and let the world push us down, or we can choose to stand up and say no more." There was a pause as the crowd absorbed her words. She continued, feeling more comfortable with each passing moment. "I wasn't strong because I confronted those bikers. I was strong because I chose to take control of the situation. I didn't let them take away my voice, my dignity, or my peace. And that's something I want all of you to remember. You don't need to be someone else to be strong. Strength is found in your decisions. Strength is found in how you respond to adversity." As she spoke, she saw heads nodding in agreement. There were moments of quiet reflection, and when she finished, there was a deep, appreciative silence. No applause, no standing ovation, just a shared understanding that something had shifted in the room. People had heard her, and they had understood her message. Alex, who had been one of the first to approach her after the incident, was sitting in the front row, absorbing every word. He had come a long way since that day in the park, but hearing the woman speak in person confirmed everything he had felt. The strength of her message had been transformative. He knew that this was the moment that had changed the course of his life. And he wasn't the only one. The weeks following the community event were filled with conversations and discussions that had sparked something deeper within the city. People, who had once stood by silently, began to speak out when they saw something wrong. Women, especially, found new courage to stand up for themselves, to fight for their rights, and to demand respect. The quiet woman had sparked a movement, not with grand speeches or public displays, but with her quiet resilience and her willingness to defy intimidation. Meanwhile, the bikers who had harassed her were still reeling from the consequences of their actions. Public opinion had swiftly turned against them. They had been shamed and reprimanded, and many of their usual haunts refused to serve them. They were no longer welcome in certain areas of the city, their reputation tarnished. The one thing they had once relied on, their intimidation, had been rendered powerless by a woman who refused to be bullied. Their leader, the man with the dark beard, who had been the most vocal in the harassment, found himself sitting at a bar, staring down into his drink. The once confident biker was now a shadow of his former self. He had underestimated the woman, and he had failed to see the impact of his actions. As he sat there, another biker from his crew walked in, looking uneasy. "Hey, you still thinking about that woman?" the second biker asked. The leader nodded. "I never thought she'd do something like that. I thought she'd fold, you know? But now, everything's changed. She turned everything around on us. We look like the idiots." The second biker shrugged. "Maybe it's time we rethink our approach. We've always ruled with fear, but that doesn't seem to work anymore. People don't want that anymore. It's just not the world we live in." The leader stared into his glass for a long moment, then set it down. "I know, but I still don't understand it. Why didn't she just back down like everyone else?" "Because she's not like everyone else," the second biker said quietly. "She showed us what happens when someone refuses to be intimidated. She took control." The community, empowered by the woman's actions, began to organize. A movement had begun, one that wasn't about standing up against physical threats alone but about challenging intimidation in all its forms. They formed support groups for those who had been bullied, harassed, or made to feel small. They worked together to provide resources and tools for those who needed help to regain their confidence and independence. At the center of this movement was the woman who had simply refused to let the bikers win. She had never intended to be a leader, but in her quiet, unassuming way, she had become exactly that. People looked to her not for answers but for inspiration. Her story was a reminder that the most powerful force in the world wasn't violence or force. It was the simple act of standing your ground when others tried to make you feel small. Back at the park, where it had all started, the woman sat on the same bench, watching the trees sway in the wind. She had come full circle. What had started as a terrifying moment of intimidation had turned into something much larger than she had ever imagined. And as she sat there, she realized that her strength wasn't just about what she had done, it was about what she had sparked in others. She had awakened a movement, and though she had never sought recognition, she understood now that her impact had been far-reaching. Her story had shown others that the real power wasn't in the hands of those who sought to oppress. It was in the hearts of those who were willing to stand up and fight back, not with violence, but with strength of will. As time went on, the quiet woman, whose name had now become synonymous with strength and resilience, continued to witness the ripple effect of her actions. The movement she had unintentionally sparked had grown, and the city was changing before her eyes. People, especially women, were no longer afraid to stand up for themselves. They were finding their voice in places where silence had once reigned. They no longer feared retribution from bullies or intimidation from those who sought to exert control. Her influence spread far beyond the confines of the park. In every corner of the city, communities were coming together, forming support networks for individuals who had been subjected to harassment, bullying, and intimidation. The once unnoticed woman had become a symbol of empowerment, not through fame or grandeur, but through her unwavering decision to stand her ground when it mattered most. One of the first major initiatives born from this movement was a community forum called Stand Strong. The idea was simple: to provide a safe space where people could come together to share their stories, seek advice, and offer support. It was a place where vulnerability was met with understanding and where intimidation had no place. The first event took place in a local community center, and it was unlike anything the city had ever seen. The woman who had started it all was invited to speak, but she hesitated. She had never wanted to be the face of anything. She just wanted to make sure that no one else would feel the way she had felt when the bikers surrounded her. But after hearing from those who had been directly impacted by the movement, she realized that her voice, though soft, could have a profound effect. When the day of the forum arrived, she stood before a large group of people, her heart racing. But as she looked around, she saw faces filled with hope, and the nervousness began to fade. She knew now that she wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for all those who had felt voiceless and alone. "We all have moments when we feel small," she began, her voice calm but strong. "When we feel like the world is against us, or that we're not worthy of standing up for ourselves. But I want to remind you that the smallest voice can make the biggest difference." There was a hush in the room as everyone listened, hanging on to her every word. "I didn't fight back against those bikers because I wanted to be a hero." She paused, making eye contact with the crowd. "I did it because I knew I couldn't let them take my power. And that's something I want you to remember. You have the power to control how you respond. You are the only one who can decide whether or not to let someone or something take that power away from you." The audience was moved. Some people wiped away tears, while others nodded in agreement, knowing that her words were more than just a speech, they were a call to action. In the months that followed, the Stand Strong initiative gained momentum. It wasn't just a forum, it became a movement, with people from all over the city coming together to share their experiences, lift each other up, and learn how to deal with intimidation in a healthy, constructive way. Workshops were held on topics like self-empowerment, conflict resolution, and assertiveness. Local businesses began to get involved, offering their support through sponsorships and by providing resources for the cause. The quiet woman had created a space where people could rediscover their strength, and in doing so, she had made the world a little bit better. She had taken something painful, her own experience, and turned it into a force for good, a lesson that anyone, no matter their circumstances, could change their life by standing up to what scared them. But as the movement grew, so did the challenges. Not everyone supported the idea of taking a stand, and not everyone agreed with the methods the group advocated. Some of the more resistant voices were business owners who felt uncomfortable with the growing public awareness about their role in allowing certain behaviors to persist in their establishments. Others were longtime residents of the city, set in their ways, who simply couldn't understand why people were suddenly standing up for themselves. One evening, as the woman walked through the local plaza, she overheard a conversation between a group of men standing outside a bar. "What's this nonsense about people taking control of their lives?" one of them scoffed. "We've all had it tough. Why should we change everything just because some woman made a scene in the park?" Another man chimed in, "She didn't even do anything. She called the cops, that's all. She got lucky." The woman, overhearing the conversation, felt a pang of frustration. The road to change had never been easy, and it wasn't going to be easy now. But she knew that it wasn't about silencing these voices, It was about showing them that things could be different. As she walked past the group, one of the men looked at her and sneered. "You're that woman, aren't you? The one who caused all that trouble in the park." She stopped in her tracks. Her first instinct was to walk away, to avoid further conflict. But something inside her pushed her to stand her ground. "Yes, I am," she replied, her voice steady. "And I'm proud of it. I didn't cause trouble. I just stood up for myself. You should try it sometime." The man stared at her for a moment, clearly taken aback by her calmness. There was no aggression in her words, only confidence. And for the first time, he seemed uncertain. The group fell silent as the woman continued to walk past them, her heart pounding but her head held high. A few days later, one of the men from that conversation came to the community center. He was hesitant at first, unsure of how to approach the growing movement. But something had changed in him since that encounter with the woman. He realized that the world was evolving, and he didn't want to be left behind. He stepped up to the podium during one of the community forums and admitted, "I didn't understand what this was all about before. I thought it was just noise. But I get it now. It's not about being loud, it's about being heard." The crowd gave him a warm reception, and for the first time, he felt the power of being part of something bigger than himself. He didn't have all the answers, but he was beginning to see the value in standing up for what was right. The quiet woman's journey had come full circle. From the moment she sat alone on that park bench, trying to ignore the bikers who tried to intimidate her, to this moment, where she stood not as a hero, but as a symbol of change, she had accomplished what many people thought impossible. She had sparked a movement that was no longer about one woman standing up for herself. It was about an entire community rising up together, supporting each other, and redefining what it meant to be empowered. Her journey wasn't over, and she knew there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time in her life, she understood that the true strength wasn't in fighting battles. It was in knowing when to stand firm, when to walk away, and most importantly, when to let others find their voice alongside hers. As the Stand Strong movement grew, so did the complexity of its impact. What had started as a single act of courage had now blossomed into something much larger, a wave of collective empowerment that spread across the city, reaching people from all walks of life. The quiet woman, who had inadvertently sparked this transformation, now found herself at the center of a whirlwind of activity and change. She had become more than just an individual. It seemed as though she had become a symbol of resilience itself. However, with growth came new challenges. The more widespread the movement became, the more attention it attracted, from the media, from business leaders, and even from the political sphere. Some welcomed it as a much-needed societal shift, while others saw it as a disruption to the status quo. The very foundation of the movement, which had been built on standing up to intimidation and claiming one's power, was now being tested by external forces. One of the most significant hurdles came when the City Council proposed new regulations in response to the increasing tensions between certain sectors of the community. The council had been receiving pressure from influential business owners who felt that the Stand Strong movement was challenging their traditional ways of doing business. Some business owners were concerned that the movement might encourage more people to speak out against inequality and unfair practices, making it harder for them to maintain their control. As the City Council convened to discuss these new proposals, the quiet woman was invited to speak, along with several other community leaders who had been at the forefront of the movement. The council meeting was packed with people, some eager to support the new regulations, others determined to push back against what they saw as unnecessary interference. The woman sat in the audience, waiting for her turn to speak. She could feel the tension in the room, the palpable divide between those who saw the movement as a threat and those who saw it as a chance for change. She had never been one to seek confrontation, but this moment felt different. This was no longer just about standing up to the bikers in the park, it was about standing up for something much bigger. The right for everyone to be heard, the right to demand respect, and the right to take control of their own lives without fear of retribution. When her name was called, the woman stood up and walked to the podium. The room fell silent as she began to speak, her voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. "We're here today because we've been taught to be afraid of our voices. We've been told to stay silent when we should speak up, to hide when we should stand tall, and to accept what others think of us instead of defining who we are. But I'm here to tell you that this movement is about reclaiming that voice. It's about rejecting the idea that we have to shrink ourselves in order to fit into someone else's mold. She paused, letting her words sink in. The audience, once divided, now seemed to be hanging on her every word. I've heard people say that we're causing a disruption. But the truth is, we're not disrupting the world. We're just reminding it that we have the right to exist fully and unapologetically. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping the room. If that's a disruption, then maybe it's one that's long overdue. Her words resonated, and the room erupted in applause. It wasn't just the supporters of the movement who clapped. It was people who had once questioned it, who had once seen it as a challenge to their comfort. In that moment, the quiet woman realized that the real power of the movement wasn't just in standing up to intimidation. It was in bringing people together, in unifying them under a common cause, and in showing that the true strength of a community was found in its collective ability to change. The council, after hearing from various voices, including those who had long opposed the movement, ultimately voted in favor of a set of new community engagement policies. These policies were designed to encourage open dialogue, promote respect, and ensure that people could stand up for their rights without fear of harassment or reprisal. The woman's testimony had helped to sway the votes, but more importantly, it had shown everyone in the room that the real change lay in their willingness to listen, to understand, and to evolve. For the woman, the victory wasn't just in the council's decision, it was in the realization that she had helped to shift the mindset of an entire community. The change she had started was no longer just a personal journey, it was a shared experience, something that had the power to touch everyone. As the months went by, the movement continued to flourish, with more people joining in and spreading the message of empowerment. The quiet woman, who had once been content to fade into the background, had become one of the most influential figures in the city. But she remained humble, always reminding herself that the true measure of her success was not the recognition she received, but the difference she made in the lives of others. One evening, while walking through the park where everything had begun, she was approached by Alex. He had been a regular at the community forums, and the woman had come to consider him a friend and a fellow advocate for change. He smiled as he walked up to her, his energy palpable. "You know," Alex said, "I still remember that day in the park. The way you stood up to those bikers, it was like you flipped a switch in me. You made me believe that I could be stronger than I thought." The woman smiled, but there was a sense of modesty in her expression. "I didn't do anything special. I just made a choice. But I'm glad it had an impact." "It had more than an impact," Alex replied, his voice filled with conviction. "It was a wake-up call for everyone. And look at what we've built together since then. The movement, the forums, the changes in the community. I think we've only scratched the surface." The woman nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude for everything they had accomplished. "We've come a long way. But there's still so much work to do. People are still afraid, still silenced. We can't stop now." "You're right," Alex agreed. "But I think we're on the right track." As the years went by, the movement continued to spread, with communities across the country adopting the principles of empowerment and self-respect that the quiet woman had championed. It wasn't just about confronting bullies or overcoming adversity, it was about changing the very culture that had allowed intimidation to thrive. People were finding the strength to speak up, to demand their rights, and to take control of their lives in a way that had once seemed impossible. The woman, now recognized for her role in this transformation, often reflected on her journey. She had never intended to become a leader or a symbol of change. All she had wanted was to protect herself, to stand up to the bikers who had tried to make her feel small. But in doing so, she had unknowingly ignited a movement that would empower countless others. And as she walked through the park that had started it all, she knew that her journey was far from over. There were always more battles to fight, more people to help, and more voices to uplift. But with each step, she was reminded of one simple truth: the greatest power wasn't in being the loudest, it was in being true to yourself, in choosing to be strong even when the world tried to break you. The quiet woman had never imagined that her decision to stand up to the bikers would snowball into something that would alter the course of her life and the lives of others in such profound ways. The Stand Strong movement had grown beyond her expectations, and while she remained humble about the impact of her actions, It was undeniable that a cultural shift was taking place. As her city transformed, she began to realize the importance of sustainability in the changes that had occurred. It was no longer just about standing up in a single moment of courage. It was about building a system of resilience that could endure. She sat in her apartment one quiet evening, reflecting on how far the movement had come. News stories continued to highlight stories of ordinary people who, in the face of intimidation, had made the decision to take control of their narrative. Her story was no longer just a singular instance. It had become the foundation of something greater. The growth of the movement wasn't just visible in the community forums or social media posts. It was felt in the everyday lives of people. Men and women, young and old, now had the language and the tools to assert their right to respect and equality. The woman had sparked a transformation, not just through her actions, but through the change in mindset that accompanied it. But there was still much work to be done. One morning, as the woman sat at a cafe, sipping her coffee and glancing over her emails, she was approached by a woman she had never met. The woman seemed hesitant but determined, and she spoke with a gentle but direct tone. "You're her, aren't you?" the woman asked. The woman looked up, slightly startled, but then smiled softly. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. I saw you speak at the community forum a few months ago," the woman said, sitting down beside her without waiting for an invitation. "You're the one who stood up to those bikers. I just wanted to say thank you." The woman's smile faded, replaced by curiosity. "Thank you? For what?" "For showing me that I don't have to keep letting people walk all over me," the woman explained, her voice filled with emotion. "I used to be so afraid of confrontation. Every time someone disrespected me, I just took it, thinking that it was easier to just stay quiet. But when I saw you, when I saw how you stood your ground, I realized something. I can be stronger than I think." The quiet woman nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She hadn't known how her actions had impacted people beyond the headlines. She had never expected to become an example for others, but here it was, someone whose life had been changed by her own. "I've been practicing what I learned from you," the woman continued. "When people try to push me around, I speak up. It's not always easy, but I know it's the right thing to do. And it's because of you." The woman reached out, placing a hand gently on the other woman's. "I'm just one person," she said softly. "You had that strength in you all along. I'm just glad you realized it." Over the following months, the quiet woman began to receive more and more messages like the one she had just received. People from all walks of life, many of them women, began to tell her how her actions had changed their perspective on how they navigated the world. They spoke of breaking free from cycles of fear, of standing up for themselves in ways they had never thought possible. And while she never set out to become a public figure, she couldn't deny the power of seeing how far-reaching her story had become. But it was also clear that not everyone had embraced the movement with the same enthusiasm. As more businesses and public spaces began to enforce inclusive policies, there was backlash. Some business owners resented the idea of being held accountable for allowing toxic behavior, and a small but vocal minority spoke out against the growing push for social change. A few argued that freedom of expression was being stifled in the name of political correctness. Despite the dissenting voices, the quiet woman remained confident in her belief that standing up for what was right was always the path forward. She understood that change was never easy and that every movement faced resistance. What mattered was the collective force that people could create when they came together and decided that the status quo was no longer acceptable. One afternoon, the quiet woman was invited to speak at a citywide summit organized by the mayor's office. The event was designed to bring together local leaders, activists, and business owners to discuss how the city could continue fostering a culture of inclusivity and respect. The mayor had taken a particular interest in the movement, praising the quiet woman's role in helping to shift public consciousness. As she stood at the podium, facing a crowd of city leaders, she realized that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about all the voices that had been lifted by the movement and the countless individuals who had taken the principles she had fought for and made them their own. "I've always believed that people have the power to change their circumstances," she said, addressing the room. "But real change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when we come together, when we create spaces where people can speak out, where they're not afraid to share their stories or stand up for themselves. It happens when we stop tolerating bullying, intimidation, and inequality, and when we start demanding respect for everyone. There was a murmur of agreement from the audience, and for the first time, the woman felt truly understood. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She had become an integral part of something bigger, something that had the potential to shape the future. What we're doing here is not just about changing policies, she continued. It's about changing mindsets, and that's where the real work lies. Every individual has the power to stand up, to make a difference. And together, we can create a world where no one is afraid to use their voice. The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time, the woman realized how far the movement had come. This wasn't just about one woman making a stand, it was about a city, a community, and eventually a country, deciding that they had had enough of fear and silence. Together, they would continue to move forward, one small act of courage at a time. The quiet woman's success, however, didn't come without personal sacrifice. As the movement grew, so did the demands on her time. She had once been able to retreat into her quiet life, but now she was constantly surrounded by people, requests for interviews, and invitations to speak at events. It was overwhelming, and at times, she found herself yearning for the solitude she had once cherished. But she knew that her journey wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had struggled with fear, who had been intimidated, and who had been made to feel small. The movement she had sparked was not about a singular person's glory, it was about creating a legacy of empowerment that would live on long after she was gone. One evening, as she walked through the park that had started it all, she saw Alex again. He was standing near the same bench where everything had begun, looking out at the city. He smiled when he saw her. "You know," he said, "this is where it all started. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be here, helping to change the world, I wouldn't have believed it." The woman smiled back, feeling a sense of pride in the work they had done. "None of us ever thought it would turn out this way. But I'm glad it did." Alex's smile faded slightly as he looked at her. "You've changed a lot of lives, you know that?" The woman nodded. "I didn't set out to be a leader. I just wanted to be heard. And I'm glad that people are listening." As the city continued to thrive and evolve, the quiet woman's work was far from done. She had planted the seeds of change, but she knew that true transformation took time. It was about generations of people learning to stand tall, to use their voice, and to never let fear silence them. The quiet woman wasn't just part of a movement, she was part of a legacy, one that would continue to inspire long after she had moved on.